Hi, my name is Dan Gomez, and this is Mental Health Super Omnia. Mental health above all. We identify and understand mental health issues and the paths for help. Today, we want to talk about parenting challenges, particularly as it relates to children who are easily frustrated or inflexible. We have three guests with us today. First, Liliana Lengua. Liliana is professor of psychology at the University of Washington and the director for the Center of Child and Family Wellbeing. She's the author of over 100 published papers and has written extensively on children's temperament, coping, and resilience. Next, we have Maria Gartstein. We're going to use Maria's nickname, Masha. Masha is also a psychology professor. Actually, she's psychology and neuroscience professor. She's the department chair at Baylor University. I believe these two, Masha and Liliana, are in competition because when I was counting up Masha's papers, it was also over 100, and I'm not really sure who has the most. We have with us the third person we have with us is Erica Burgoon. Erica is a member of the leadership team at Equilibria Psychological and a licensed clinical psychologist with 25 years of experience. She provides clinical services across the lifespan and specializes in working with depression, anxiety, and trauma. Liliana, Masha, we have read Parenting with Temperament in Mind, Navigating the Challenges and Celebrating Your Child's Strengths. Today, we want to focus on parenting children who are easily frustrated and those that are inflexible. In addition, we want to look at that given the enormous time demands that a parent has, while many times also dealing with another parent who has a different parenting style altogether. So could you briefly frame up for us what easily frustrated and or inflexible means versus typical child behavior?
I can take frustration, and maybe Masha, you could take inflexibility.
Sure.
Yeah, kids who are easily frustrated, what they're looking like on the surface is their frustration or their anger flares. Flares more often. It comes up either more often or more intensely. It doesn't seem to always fit the situation exactly. And they're often just conveying dissatisfaction with a limit, with an instruction, a responsibility they have to fulfill. They'll fight you about their homework or doing their homework. They'll fight you about doing their chores. And it happens repeatedly, even though those things come up every day or once a week. And we know that it's rooted in their reward system. They tend to be really oriented towards the things they find pleasurable or rewarding or exciting in life. And so they really are approach oriented. They're going towards reward. They're going towards the things they want. And when something about their life, the structure in their life, a rule in the household or a guidance from the parent, when something blocks them from doing what they want or getting what they want, their frustration flares pretty easily. And it just comes up more easily, more readily, and more intensely than you would see with other children who are less easily frustrated.
I'll take the inflexibility. So I think with the children who are really sort of far along the inflexibility scale, if you will, let's start with, everybody sort of has their moments when they want something a certain way, or, not liking something unpredictable that's happening. If you go to the airport, your flight gets canceled or delayed. This isn't a happy moment for anybody, right? So some discomfort, some distress sort of in the face of that, fussing, crying, whining. I mean, we do some variants of that in adulthood. That's all expected and normative. I think that the kids whose parents, caregivers really begin to struggle with inflexibility are so across the board, right? It's not that they have like some favorite things that they like to do a certain way or some preferred things that they gravitate towards, but any sort of novelty, any change in routine becomes, highly problematic, very difficult to handle or to cope with. Any deviation, the one thing that they sort of like to wear, if that's dirty, that's a crisis, right? So inflexibility in the face of kind of really small changes that most kids would probably be able to roll with, and doing so kind of consistently across situations and kind of regardless of, demands or expectations or who they may be with. Now with inflexibility, kids kind of get to that behavioral style, if you will, through a couple of different pathways that we talk about in the book. So for some kids, this is really a way of kind of coping with fear and anxiety, right? It's like, I just don't like new things. And if I keep things exactly the same, everything is predictable and I never have to experience that unpleasantness. And of course, the physiology of fear and anxiety is particularly unpleasant. And that understandably so, right? And so that tendency to be rigid, to keep things exactly the same, as I said, is a way to sort of minimize that. But for other kids, it's really more of a challenge inherent in making choices. And that's really more of kind of an attention-based skill, if you will. In the book, we talk about effortful control. That's a term that's a lot of temperament researchers use. It has to do with kind of an ability to basically not always do the same thing, always make kind of the preferred, the familiar choice, but to be able to sort of consider the situation and maybe make a choice that's adaptive for the situation. That's like a novel choice, right? That's something that you haven't done before. So that's really sort of the foundation for this ability, as I said, is attentional in nature. People talk about executive attention, this sort of higher order set of attentional skills that have to do with selective attention and switching attention and short-term memory and whatnot. I don't want to go into kind of a cognitive psychology lesson with you all, but suffice to say that it's really relying on kind of this foundation of frontal lobe mediated, attentional skill set that develops as kids mature, and for some sort of lag behind and are not as advanced, and creates challenges with flexibility.
And before we dive deeper into these two temperamental styles, I think, Masha, you just gave us a taste of this in what you were sharing about some of the different pathways that inflexibility occurs for kids. But in the book, you give information both from your research, and I really appreciated the personal examples, whether your own children or observations of other children in your lives, that a lot of these temperamental styles, in part, or at least some parts, we seem to come into the world with them. That we can see evidence of them when kids are very young, even from the time of birth. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what some of the evidence is that some of this may be, when we talk about nature versus nurture, some of this may be nature?
Go ahead, Masha.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, we have sort of different streams of evidence for that. There's a whole line of research looking at, people call behavioral genetics, where people do look at the genetic contribution to different traits in this particular field mostly, or typically by kind of looking at similarity between identical twins versus ones that are fraternal, right? Because identical twins are sort of 100% the same in terms of their genetic contributions. And so, long story short, I mean, there's clearly a genetic contribution that is behind most temperament styles, certainly the ones that we're discussing today. There's some molecular genetics evidence there as well. And it is evident very early in life. Now, when I say that, I always kind of have this voice in the back of my head that, well, nature plays a role very early on. I mean, even in utero, you can have some environmental or contextual factors that impact development. So I, want to make sure I sort of nod to that, but it is compelling that there's a big contribution that is played by nature when you have these temperament dimensions that are evident sort of, out of the womb. I personally work a lot with infants, and the youngest that I work with respect to temperament are probably in their second month of age. They don't come to the lab until they're 6 months of age. But by the time we see them in the lab, these temperament styles, these behavioral tendencies are very, very evident, and the individual differences are profound. So it's very interesting to study this early on. And I think, the other thing I'll say about that is that when I first began to do infant temperament work, I was really impressed to see how that this was really a substantial field. And one of the reasons why people were attracted to doing this work with babies is precisely because the thinking was, this is sort of like, a temperament unspoiled by nature, by environment. Now, we have since then learned, again, as I was saying earlier, that environmental impacts are early and profound, and so you can't really say that. But nonetheless, it is very interesting, and certainly speaks to the power of these genetic contributions that we do know are there.
I think it's so important because obviously we're not saying that parenting's not important. In fact, it's so important. You wrote a book about it, but there's that phrase, I was a great parent until I became one. So when you see that mom or that dad at the grocery store struggling with their child, and those thoughts of like, I would never let my child act like that. I do think it's important that we are aware that there's an interplay of nature and nurture. And the environmental factors we see in kids.
And that was a big reason for us writing the book. And there's a lot of parenting advice out there, and it really is framed as one size fits all. And if your child isn't doing it the way you want them to, then you're doing it wrong, right? And it was really important to both give parents grace and help them understand the differences that their kids might be bringing, and to be encouraging. Like, there are ways to handle this. Like, there are things that you can do to tailor your parenting to your child. So we really, really want to emphasize the both. And yes, your child is coming in with some characteristics, and the things we do as parents or educators or the people around these kids actually also make a difference. So it's both and.
Temperament researchers a lot of times will say, well, you have to have more than one kid to really appreciate the power of temperament, and Lily certainly has a temperament laboratory in her own home, but I only have the one daughter. But to me, the power of temperament was evident when I noticed traced in her that I was like, well, this is not me. This isn't anybody on my side of the family. She was a super active baby. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is, my husband, my partner, 100%, and his genetic contribution. So for me, learning to work with that, when that is not something, that I myself sort of embody or, I grew up with, was really quite a challenge. And thank goodness I knew about temperament.
Yeah.
So you have a child that is, let's just say, either inflexible or easily frustrated. Easily frustrated, as I've talked to parents, easily frustrated seems to be a big issue. At the same time, you have two parents, or potentially you have two parents. One obviously doing most of the work, but the second one is parent as well. And sometimes they have entirely different parenting styles. Do you end up spending more time dealing with the parents and making sure that they understand the parenting style that they have to present to help their child, or is that easily negotiated?
Co-parenting is always hard. It's always a challenge, whatever the topic, whatever the issue, discipline, philosophy, in all cases. I think that there's an added layer when we're talking about this, because the parents' personalities or temperament play a role as well. And like, Masha was alluding to this, that, you see or you don't see yourself in the child. And sometimes seeing your own personality in your child gives you some better understanding, but it can also lead you to butt heads more, right? Like with my, easily frustrated son, I always joke, he inherited that from my dad, not me. I'm not like that, right? But when we would have these, flare-ups, I realized, oh, I'm the one who has to manage my emotions and manage how I'm interacting with him, even though he's frustrating me as much as I'm frustrating him. And so when you asked, do you mostly have to deal with the parents? I think when children are younger, we absolutely mostly have to deal with the parents, because it's not only how do you manage your child's emotions and behaviors so that they're developing to be more effective in the world. And, it's also in order to do that, I have to manage my own emotions and behaviors to be more effective in parenting them. And so the co-parenting question is just this whole other layer, because it's not just differences in philosophies, but also differences in tolerance, in the level of emotion I can tolerate, in the level of self-control I manage, those kinds of things too. So I'm validating that it's challenging, and parents have to kind of try to negotiate a place where they can be consistent, because the consistency, especially for easily frustrated kids, but for all of them, is a critical piece of helping them grow into more effective people.
I second everything that Lily said, and I'm a clinician by training, and I had a practice at one point. Now I use my clinical skills in administration. But parents of young kids who seek help for a variety of sort of behavioral issues would often be surprised at the amount of time that you spend working with them and not the child in that clinical context. But it's because, especially for young kids, the hour a week that they may be spending in the office with me or with you, right? It's a sort of a drop in the bucket. They're with their parents most of the time. And so we have to work with the parents to make sure that it's the home environment that sort of changes in the more adaptive direction, and a direction that's going to support, more positive, more adaptive behavioral development for that child.
Yeah, I often find myself in practice that when parents come into the office and they are feeling challenged by their children's behaviors, and the two we're highlighting today are kids who are easily frustrated or inflexible kids, there's often a sense of, or even a direct ask, tell me what to do when they are having the temper tantrum or they're refusing to follow the direction I gave them. What do I do in that moment to fix it, to make it stop? And I know, and your book certainly highlights that it's not just about that moment. And you talk about the strategies that the parents can use in the calmer moments. And maybe we could start with the easily frustrated children. Lily, can you talk to us about some of the strategies that you highlighted in the book, and some of the ways that parents can approach their children, not just when they're frustrated, but in parenting them in general?
Yeah. In the book, we talk about 4 parenting kind of pillars or principles. And, we say be present, be warm, scaffold, or be balanced, and be consistent. And so those are the 4 things we recommend to all parents. And it's just maybe understanding them differently or in a different measure when we are working with our children's different temperaments. So with easily frustrated children, knowing that they're very reward oriented, the first thing we always say is your relationship with your child can be that rewarding experience, especially with younger kids. And when we start younger, it lasts longer. And so when they have that positive time, when we establish a really warm, positive relationship, especially, really dedicating a few minutes a day to build that relationship, they find that rewarding. And so that's a first step in them wanting to maintain the warmth of that relationship, the positive quality of that relationship. And the other piece that we say in being balanced is really thinking about how to scaffold their experiences, how to provide them with choices and boundaries and limits around what they can and can't be doing at certain times, and just like kind of building in the reinforcement and the positive experience that is tied to having to do things they don't want to do, because this almost always comes up with them having to give up something or do something they don't want to do. And then with easily frustrated kids, we talk about this, that consistency is an incredibly important piece, and having consistent structure and rules and consequences is really helpful for them, because when they're reward oriented, they're seeing the reward in their world. Like they want to play a video game, or they want to go play or go outside and play. And if that is all they see, then anything that gets in the way becomes really infuriating. But if the daily routine is so routine that they know that fighting back isn't going to change it, and they just get it done, and then they get to do the thing they want to do, that really helps them. It helps amplify that in their mind. This is just the routine. This is the thing I need to do, and it's going to happen every time. So for not all kids need that. Some kids can have variation in their routine and it not disrupt their emotions and their productivity in their life. But for easily frustrated kids, that consistency is critically important. And I will say that it does take a lot of time, really quick. It does take a lot of time, but I always tell parents, you're spending time arguing with them or dealing with the flare up or the difficulty. It takes a lot of time to build this consistency and scaffolding and the relationship, but it then it reduces the amount of time you spend in those arguments, in the battle, in the struggle. And so the time is like investing in a future benefit. Sorry, Daniel.
It's fine. Some of us have multiple children, right? So if we have to spend an enormous amount of time with creating consistency for one child, what's the impact on the other children that I have?
Yeah, I have 3 kids, and really that level of consistency was only necessary for my middle one. But we created some of the routines we created for the whole family, so that it became just normative. It wasn't an adaptation, or we weren't doing something just for my middle child. We were doing it for the whole family. And for the other 2 kids, it didn't impact them. They would have been doing those things anyway. Some of the rules we had to establish were unique to one child or another. And we just made that normative too. We just said, you all are doing different things. You have different ways of approaching your homework or your chores or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so the goal is to just get this done, and you guys can approach it in different ways. And so it's a little bit of, again, I'll say both, and having a whole family culture is helpful in many cases. And for some things, you might tailor them. So for example, cleaning your room, our family had, chores every Saturday morning. It was just a Saturday morning thing. We did it every Saturday. It was the whole family culture. I could tell 2 of my kids, just go clean your room, and I would pop in and they were spotless. The other one needed a lot of scaffolding and structure. He needed a list of things to do. This goes there, make a checklist for them. That's the scaffolding, the structuring part that really helped. And for him, he wasn't allowed to get on a video game or watch TV until the room was done. I didn't need to do that for the girls because they were cleaning their room anyway. So that's an example of a whole family culture as well as a tailored approach.
I really appreciated the framing or the reframing around the time that parents invest in this, because it is a lot of time, it does require a lot of effort. And yet, as you said, you're spending a lot of time arguing, debating, cajoling, and doing so often in a household with an easily frustrated child. I know every day can feel like you're stepping onto the battlefield, and these things happen over and over again. So I think that is an important way of framing the investment that parents will make, both in the office if they're coming in to see someone, but also in the efforts they're going to make at the outset to try to, make some changes that may be helpful to their child with a certain type of temperament. And the time in, I find, is so important, the special time with your child. Dan had mentioned if you have different children with different needs, and maybe not all of them are easily frustrated, but that time in can be such a wonderful thing to build in with every child in a family with multiple children. I appreciate highlighting that. I was also thinking about in the chapter in the book on easily frustrated children, too often these households become a power struggle, and the emphasis for parents a lot becomes on, and understandably so, right? We live busy lives. When we need our kids to do something, we often feel like we need them to do it in the next 5 minutes so we can move on to the next thing. And the emphasis starts to be on gaining compliance in the moment, versus this approach that you talk about. I really find that tends to be about skill building. It sounds like you're speaking to the easily frustrated child learning skills to more easily over time manage some of those frustrations and those tough moments on their own. And I guess if you can speak, I was thinking maybe like if you could talk a little bit about some of those skills that we're trying to help our easily frustrated children build.
Do you want to take that, Masha?
I can certainly start. I mean, I think, if we're talking about kind of early on in childhood, with a child who is easily frustrated, maybe one critical skill can be sort of framed as, making good choices in the context of either, following a rule, or, something that they're being told by a parent or another adult versus doing that thing that they're naturally driven to do. That's so fun and, is just really desirable. And, so with my daughter, one situation where that we struggled with that was that, she had a difficult time leading playgrounds, and when she was younger, we would call them big kid slide. And, so very attractive, other kids are there enjoying themselves. And oftentimes there'd be a limited amount of time that we could stay there. And I'll be honest with you, on more than one occasion, I ended up carrying her away from the big kid slide, feeling like a terrible parent, right? Because my child is screaming and crying, thinking, if there are people here that I work with clinically, what are they going to think of me as a clinician? But I would always, sort of away from that situation, tell her, look, I know this is one of the things you really like, but when it's time to go, it's time to go. And that kind of became my mantra that I kept repeating to her in the moment, but also away when we were not in the middle of this power struggle, when we had an opportunity to sort of reason. And at some point, and this was a very joyful day for me, we were in this situation at a playground, and I looked at my watch and I said, and she, I didn't even have to say it. She said, I know, when it's time to go, it's time to go. And I'm like, oh, wow, it has actually been sinking in this whole time. But, many, many trials, as they say. So just kind of hanging in there and being patient and, planting those seeds away from the challenging situation. And then, working with a challenging situation in sort of as calm and as matter of fact way as possible, but sometimes setting that limit, it's not pretty.
But you were calm, you were consistent, and eventually that had to be such a great moment when you saw that skill transfer that she had picked it up.
It really was. I couldn't wait to go home and tell my husband.
Yeah, and I think about the times, the opportunities that aren't in the heated moments or in the emotionally charged moments where those choices can be laid out ahead of time. So, for example, talking through, okay, what do you, and incorporating the child when they're a little bit older in some of that problem solving. So your room needs to get cleaned or your homework needs to get done. What do you think is a good opportunity for you, like, to reward yourself when those are done, and let them help you work on that, so that they have a personal investment in the plan, and that extra cognitive step, that extra thinking step, not immediately, it takes repetition, but eventually becomes their own thinking step. Oh, if I get this done, then I can do that. So one of the skills we're trying to build in is the pause, the planning, and then just trying to be consistent. It's actually funny because in thinking about having this conversation today, my now 23-year-old son, almost 23-year-old son, who was the one who he and I would go out a lot, and we'd have a lot of angry flare-ups. He's much calmer now. He hardly has, I know he's angry, and I ask him, what are you doing? We're like, what did you learn? How did you translate that skill? And it has become unconscious for him. He was like, I don't know. I can't tell you what I'm doing. I guess I'm just thinking, when I'm mad, I'm just thinking about, is it going to be effective if I say this or do that? Or, so he built in those effectiveness skills, that question, what is effective in this moment? That we ask parents to ask themselves. I realized I must have been asking him that much of his childhood, like, how do you want to be effective in this moment? And that translated into his own way of dealing with his feelings.
I think that ultimately, I don't think you can teach someone how to lower their level of arousal, how to tolerate this, unpleasant physiology. They have to figure it out. But as parents, as adults, as, caregivers and teachers, we can give them the space to do that in an adaptive and positive way, right? And we can encourage them to do it, and we can praise them for doing it, and point out the situations where we see them doing it, so that it becomes more of this unconscious thing that Lily's talking about.
I found your book very easy to read, very easy to segment, pick up. This is what I need right now, so I know when to apply it. But the United States is a big place, and it's a giant melting pot. We used to always talk about it being a melting pot in days gone by. So the 4 things that you ask parents to do, and the temperaments that you're dealing with in the book, does that get modified by culture? Or some of the stronger cultures from the many immigrant communities that we have?
Masha, do you want to talk about temperament across cultures, and then I'm happy to tackle some of the parenting burden?
I mean, the short answer, of course, is yes, right? I mean, culture is sort of the bigger context for parenting, for parent-child interactions, for how parents perceive temperament, for what they think is normative versus challenging. So it's 100% relevant. I mean, I'd like to think that the ideas that are in the book are still going to be, applicable. It's just a question of how to apply them within that cultural context. For example, many cultures are being more fearful, being sort of more shy, more avoidant is absolutely not something that would be considered to be a problematic way of relating to the world. Well, then perhaps the ideas about working with that in the book are not going to be the place where the parent will gravitate, or the place where they really need to sort of invest a lot of time. However, what happens a lot, in a place like United States, where people come from all over the world, when you find yourself in the United States, you sort of notice that other kids are more outgoing. They're encouraged to be more outgoing. Our culture really values things like being a leader and speaking up. I think it sort of creates a situation where a parent needs to decide, do they want to encourage those kinds of characteristics as well? Or is it a kind of more appropriate, more adaptive, kind of a better choice for them to rely on kind of more traditional child rearing practices, have those more traditional values kind of embodied in the way that they approach their child? And there's not necessarily a right answer, one right answer to that question. I mean, my sense is that in general, kind of around the world, people raise their children in a way that is appropriate for their cultural context, right? They encourage the traits that help the child be well adjusted in their cultural context. There are challenges when you find yourself kind of migrating for one reason or another from your culture of origin to a host culture that embodies kind of or values these characteristics differently. And it's complicated, because do you want to sort of focus on making sure that your child is kind of optimizing fitting into this mainstream culture, or not? And maybe the answer is no. I mean, there are many places in the United States where you can live in a place where you're surrounded by those from your native country, and so that idea fitting into the mainstream may not really resonate or be all that important. You know this about me, Daniel, but I grew up in Russia. My family immigrated to the United States when I was almost 13, and they came to the Midwest, and I had one Russian friend, and she had been in the U.S. maybe for a year or two, was very acculturated, spoke English. And then that friend's family moved to New York, and I had an opportunity, a year or so later, to visit her in Brighton Beach. All of her friends were Russian. They only spoke Russian. It was just a completely different cultural context, right? So, I mean, that's not a temperament story, but I think that speaks to the power of culture kind of more generally, and the fact that there's not sort of like, a one solution to how to negotiate that in any context, but particularly in terms of, working with temperament as a parent.
Yeah, and I'd like to highlight a different idea about that, and that's family culture. Like not just the kind of societal culture around you, but your family's culture. And my parents are also immigrants and came from a very, what I'll call, traditional old world style of parenting. And we grew up in Southern California where it was not that at all. And so I think families can choose the extent to which they want more of that hierarchical or traditional family structure, or a more horizontal or egalitarian family decisions, and still being able to recognize that the principles of being present, being warm, being balanced or scaffolding, and being consistent are important. You find the degree to which you can do those things in your own family's values and culture, whether you're more traditional or hierarchical or more egalitarian. One of the things that comes up a lot is in some perspectives of parenting that are really prevalent in some parts of our country right now is this idea that if you use consequence rewards and consequences with your kids, you're like treating them like animals or dogs, like you're training them, and it's not, they don't feel like that's the right way, or you can't say no to your kids. It's another big thing right now. And I would just say that if we think about our own lives as adults and our kids' lives in school, they're experiencing these natural rewards and consequences and we're experiencing them in our jobs, in our relationships with peers and family. Like it's a natural part. And so helping your kids relate to those and adjust to those is an important part, especially if you have a child who's extreme on one of these temperament characteristics that we talk about. It's really providing them an opportunity to learn to engage in the world in an adaptive way, in a way that, so it's okay if you choose not to do that, but it's also okay if a parent chooses to do that.
I think you touched on something really important. I'm sorry. I just want to kind of connect what Lily was just saying with the idea that I shared earlier about helping our children to kind of like, work with that unpleasant physiology and kind of being able to calm down on their own. That requires some limit setting. The way that you create that space is by saying, these behaviors are not appropriate. This is not acceptable. This is the time for you to figure out how to make a better choice, right? And if the answer is always yes, and if the approach is you just do whatever you want, then there's never kind of an opportunity to learn how to do that. And of course, when our children leave the home, other people aren't always going to say yes, and other people aren't always going to just be like, do whatever you want. And then they're for sure going to be downstream challenges.
Yeah, related to what both of you were just talking to or speaking to, the chapter on inflexible children discusses using an approach that includes validation and structure. And in hearing you talk about being warm, I take from that the notion that we can empathize with our children's feelings warmly, we can be understanding, and still set limits, have expectations, create a structure in which they can meet expectations that we have for them. And talk to us a little bit about that. What does that sound like for a parent to approach a child in a moment in which, let's say, the child's being very inflexible or rigid, or is, refusing to meet an expectation out of that inflexibility? What does that sound like for a parent to meet that with both validation and structure?
Well, you can always empathize with the feeling. I mean, the feeling is what it is. It's not wrong to feel uncomfortable, or, to be like, it's not, that's not what I want to do. I don't want to do that. And I think that you can absolutely kind of relate to it and say, well, I get it. This isn't, you'd rather do this, or this isn't your favorite, or yeah, that is uncomfortable, right? But at the same time, some things have to get done, and so in addition, then you can also sort of follow up by saying, and if it's an uncomfortable sort of thing and it's not dangerous, right? Like we can do this thing that that may be a struggle or may not be what we want to do. We can go to school even though we have a substitute teacher and things are going to be different today. Or we can start we can go to preschool even though it's a new setting, and you don't know what to expect there. Other kids do it. We have to go to work. This is how it works. So just kind of acknowledging the feeling that's there, and sort of validating it, and even maybe agreeing with it to some extent, and at the same time kind of piggybacking on that with, and this is how we need to do things, right? Because in the preschool situation, because I have to go to work, I wish I could spend a day at home with you, but my boss wouldn't like that. Or whatever, and I think that with respect to flexibility, and again, this is probably not one of those things that you want to do in the moment if this is a power struggle kind of situation, but living flexibility yourself, modeling flexibility, and pointing out to your child when you're being flexible, or maybe when you're making a choice that's uncomfortable for you, right? So well, I don't really want to do this either, but this is what I do. I'm starting a new job, and there are going to be things there that I'm not going to know what to do with, and well, I'll figure it out, and you'll figure out, how things work in this new classroom, or with this new preschool teacher, whatever the situation may be. I mean, I think that the sort of rule of thumb, and we talk about this in the book, is that a lot of this conversation needs to happen, sort of away from the challenging situation. You need to sort of, develop these themes away from the challenging situation. And then some key elements of what you're talking about can be said in the heated moment, right? So maybe you have this whole conversation about how we have to do things that are uncomfortable, and if they're not dangerous, and then this is something that's ultimately good for us, like going to school or going to a birthday party, right? That's just something we need to do. In the moment, you don't want to go into that whole long explanation, but you can say, remember we talked about this. Yeah, I get it. Like, it doesn't feel great. This is what we need to do.
I also think that it's really helpful to think about small successive approximations. And I use that term that we use in behaviorism, but it's okay to start with a small thing, tackle the small thing, and help your child recognize that the discomfort that comes with not being able to do what they want is actually tolerable. So little things like, my youngest wouldn't be able to tolerate a drop of water on clothing and wanted to change. And I said, okay, you can change, but we're going to set a timer. And we'd set the timer for something simple, like a minute. But then we extended that to 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And so that, two things she learned: one, it dries, and two, the intolerable feeling was actually something she could overcome and tolerate. And then we went on to the next thing that was maybe also difficult is there's a little string hanging out on a piece of clothing. Well, she would want me to cut it. I was like, yes, I'll cut it, but let's set a timer and give it 30 seconds, give it a minute. And just those were tiny things. Those weren't the big challenges. The other piece of structuring that for them is when a child has difficulty making choices. You say, what dessert do you want? And the world is too big for them. And they always go to the same dessert. One could start giving them two options that are not the thing they always go to. These are the two options you have. And start building that from the very ground up, that ability to pause and think and tolerate a little discomfort and then make a choice. So I think the more we can kind of build the skill from the ground up, from small opportunities for tolerating difficult emotions, then it kind of adds to or gives that ability to happen in the harder situations.
And if this is particularly difficult to do, you can also kind of create a situation where well, I know these are your non-preferred things that you get to choose from, but this is sort of beyond my control. Well, these are the only kinds of cookies they had at the bakery, right? It's well, they ran out of whatever the preferred choice was. And so if you have a parent who maybe really kind of struggles with, perceiving themselves as the bad guy in the situation, or the child really escalates very quickly, that can be another route. It's a little deceptive, but it's for good.
I have the benefit of now my kids being grown and having insight and being able to look back at things. And so I try to share that with parents only because when you're still dealing with them when they're little, kind of, you think you're doing something terrible to them when you set these limits or make these rules or make them suffer something. But my daughter, who, when we would go to restaurants, she would choose the same thing every time, that she never deviated. If it was a Mexican restaurant we had, she would have refried beans with no cheese, and that was all she ate. And she looks back and she goes, I can't believe I missed out on, how much variety in the food, how much flavor, how many things there are that I could have been exploring, more and more. And so I appreciate, she's appreciative that we would encourage her to deviate and kind of push her a little bit. And so it's helpful as a parent to be able to hear that reinforcement in retrospect, because it's oh, okay, I felt terrible at the time, but now I'm glad she can see that was for her benefit.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I want to ask each of you one question, get a quick answer, and then I'll give each of you an opportunity to summarize. Lily, let me start with you. What is the biggest mistake parents make with a child who's easily frustrated?
Giving in.
Giving in.
The frustration, the anger, the battles. Sometimes a parent is too tired to deal with it. They've had it up to here with the same battle over and over again. It's your turn to wash the dishes, and they're fighting you, and that happens every fourth day because they're on the rotation, and this is their fourth day, and it's gone on for years. You just get worn out, you get tired, and so I think the giving in on or giving up on the consistency, being calm and consistent is the answer. And sometimes we're just too tired to do it. And that's, I give parents grace. You get tired, you're exhausted, you can't do it, or you're just fed up, right? And but that tends to reinforce the arguing then. So every now and then is okay, but for the most part, being calm and consistent is really important. I think the other is responding in kind. They're yelling, you start yelling, and that just escalates the situation. But that's often also a sign of just being tired of doing the same thing over and over again, and so you lose your patience. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay. Masha, a question for you. What parent reaction do you most worry about with an inflexible child?
It's kind of similar to what Lily was just saying. I think it's just constant accommodation of rigidity. You like these things a certain way, and by God, this is how it's going to happen every time, and I'm not going to budge that. And I think that also a lot of times this accommodation is a function of the fact that, nobody wants a tantrum. Nobody wants to have to deal with, kind of children will always escalate faster than parents, right? That sort of 0 to 60 of like everything was fine and now we're on the floor kicking and screaming. That teaches parents, I think, pretty quickly that to be accommodating. And at the same time, we also know that accommodation means that you're not going to be teaching your child flexibility, that you're not going to be budging this approach, regardless of whether it comes from kind of a fear-based situation or it's just kind of a struggle with making choices. And so
Erica, do you have
oops, sorry. Can I say one other quick, kind of going to the point that Lily was making about like grace for parents and understanding that like sometimes you're too tired and it just, this is not this, we can't take it on. Like you have to be, as a parent, honest with yourself. And if it's a day where you just have to accommodate because you haven't slept or, whatever, then just, realize that and don't start the process of trying to set a limit when you're just not up to it. Just accommodate and come back another day when it's a better day for you.
Makes sense. Erica, did you have a favorite part of the book? Favorite story? Actually, my favorite story, by the way, Lily, was yours. I think it was in the introduction, where your brand new baby was screaming, and on day 2, a nurse came in and figured out exactly what she needed to do to get him calmed down. Fascinating little story. Erica, did you have a favorite story or favorite part of the book?
I don't know about a favorite story. What resonates the most with me is, I think, as we've talked about today, there's a lot of advice out there for parents. There's a lot of models of therapy for children. But I think that one of the common features that effective and successful models share that Lily and Masha really speak to is the importance of relationship with your child. That is the most powerful tool in parenting. And for kids who are maybe more challenging to parent, their life can become a cycle of, feeling like they haven't met expectations again. People are angry with them. People are frustrated with them. And the joy in parenting can get lost. And so I really appreciate that your approach, and it seems your book addresses a lot of different temperament types and parenting challenges, but there's this core feature of finding the joy with your children and building the relationship away from the challenging times. And that's something that I always appreciate when I find in a book for parents or an approach for parents. So I certainly appreciate you highlighting that.
Thank you. I want to give you, Masha, and you, Lily, an opportunity for the last word. You could promote anything you'd like to promote or summarize any way you would like to summarize. Lily, we'll go with you first.
Thanks. I appreciate this conversation. Thanks for inviting us. And I think it highlights for me the 2 main reasons why we tackled this book. And that is, first, that a lot of the information about temperament, the models that are even being taught in med school to pediatricians or educators was really old. It was coming from something from the 1950s, and we've come a long way since then. We have a really good understanding, or a much better understanding, of not just what temperament is and how parents interact with that temperament, but understanding it from a physiological perspective. And one of the things we really wanted to do is give parents a little bit of that understanding so that they can have a more kind of greater empathy and validating a relationship with their kids. And then the second piece is what we've already talked about here. Like, parenting advice isn't one size fits all. And so much of what is available to parents is one size fits all, and also feels like it can become judgmental. Like, it can become, if you're not doing it this way, something's wrong with how you're parenting. And if your child is reacting this way, something's wrong with how you're parenting. And we just wanted to provide a more holistic perspective on that parent-child relationship and where some of those challenges come from. And I'll just say one last thing is that we've talked about some of the challenges today in this conversation, but we do try to also highlight some of the strengths that these characteristics bring, that each child comes with strengths as well. And we just wanted to make sure parents could resonate with that.
Masha?
Well, that was a fabulous summary. I will just I could add, maybe circling back to what we started with today, and that is that biology behind temperament is strong. And so, as a parent, um, if you're working with a child who brings some challenges with their temperament, with their kind of behavioral tendencies, it's not possible to really sort of confront that head on, but it is possible to kind of channel your child's temperament in a more adaptive and a more positive direction. That is something we're able to do. And having a positive relationship, celebrating your child's strengths, and letting them do the things that they want to do when it's safe and appropriate will help you be more effective at that channeling.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me close by saying that our sponsor today is Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services, whose mission is to help individuals achieve their personal potential and long-term growth by compassionately and respectfully helping clients live in balance. Visit equilibriapcs.com, equilibriapcs.com. You can look for them on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also look for me on Instagram, Daniel J. Gomez 24, and on LinkedIn. Now for the disclaimer. I am not a medical professional, and I am not providing medical advice. The opinion of our speakers is solely their own. This podcast is copyrighted and cannot be reproduced without the express written consent of EPCS Management, LLC.